Of all the generals who fought under the banner of the Third Reich, which one struck the deepest fear into the hearts of Allied soldiers? Was it the man who raced across the North African desert with a reputation bordering on legend? Or was it a commander whose name most people have never heard, yet whose decisions shaped the fates of millions? The answer is not as simple as you might think. Germany produced some of the most tactically gifted military minds of the 20th century, men who combined ruthless efficiency with battlefield brilliance. Some earned their reputations through daring offensives, others through a stubborn, grinding defense that bled their enemies white. What made them feared was not cruelty alone, though some were certainly cruel. It was competence. It was the knowledge, shared by every Allied soldier who faced them, that the man on the other side of the line knew exactly what he was doing. These are the 10 most feared German generals of the Second World War, and the stories behind the fear they inspired. Let us begin with the name that needs no introduction. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, became the most famous German general of the war, and for good reason. In February 1941, Rommel arrived in Libya with a small German force meant only to prop up Italy's collapsing North African campaign. He was ordered to hold a defensive line. Instead, within weeks, he had thrown the British back hundreds of miles across the Libyan desert. He moved fast, struck where he was least expected, and treated the vast Saharan expanse like an open ocean, maneuvering his armored columns with the instincts of a natural-born tactician. The British feared him so deeply that their own commander, Claude Auchinleck, issued an extraordinary order in 1941, telling his officers to stop referring to Rommel by name, worried that the mere mention of him was destroying morale across the Eighth Army. Churchill himself admitted in the House of Commons that Rommel was a daring and skillful opponent, but the Desert Fox was not invincible. His supply lines stretched dangerously thin across the Mediterranean, strangled by the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. At El Alamein in October and November of 1942, Bernard Montgomery finally broke his army in a grinding battle of attrition that negated Rommel's advantages in mobility. What made Rommel uniquely feared was not just his tactical brilliance, but his personal mystique. He led from the front lines, appeared where no commanding general should be, and seemed to read his enemy's mind before they could act. Even after North Africa, even after his forced suicide in October 1944, following a connection to the assassination plot against Hitler, the legend endured. Rommel was the general the Allies respected as much as they feared, a rare figure whose enemies mourned his passing. But fear on the battlefield came in many forms, and few commanders inspired more operational dread than Heinz Guderian, the father of blitzkrieg. Guderian did not just use tanks, he fundamentally reimagined what armored forces could accomplish. Throughout the 1930s, he had argued against the military establishment, insisting that tanks should not be scattered among infantry divisions, but massed into concentrated panzer formations, capable of punching through enemy lines and exploiting the breakthrough at speed. In May 1940, it was Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps that drove through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest and crossed the Meuse River at Sedan. He pushed so deep into France so quickly that even his own high command panicked and ordered him to halt. Guderian famously obeyed the letter of the order while ignoring its spirit, pushing his reconnaissance elements forward while claiming he was merely conducting a reconnaissance in force. Within 6 weeks, France had collapsed. A year later, in the summer of 1941, Guderian's panzers drove deep into the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa, encircling entire Soviet armies in vast pockets of destruction. His 2nd Panzer Group helped seal the enormous Kiev encirclement, capturing over 600,000 Soviet soldiers in one of the largest surrenders in military history. What made Guderian feared was his relentless belief in speed. He insisted that once a breakthrough was achieved, a commander must never stop, never consolidate, never give the enemy time to think or reorganize. His opponents learned this lesson the hard way, over and over again, from the fields of France to the steppes of Russia. Now here is a name that will surprise many of you, and yet numerous historians consider him the finest operational mind Germany produced during the entire war. Erich von Manstein remains far less famous than Rommel among casual observers, but among military professionals and scholars, his reputation towers above nearly everyone else on this list. It was Manstein who conceived the audacious plan that destroyed France in 1940, the Sichelschnitt, or sickle cut, a daring armored thrust through the Ardennes that bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line and cut the Allied armies in two. The German High Command nearly rejected the plan as reckless, but Hitler approved it, and the result was one of the most complete and devastating victories in modern military history. On the Eastern Front, Manstein demonstrated an even more extraordinary gift for operational warfare. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad in early 1943, when Germany's entire Sixth Army was destroyed and the Southern Front was crumbling, it was Manstein who orchestrated one of the war's great recoveries. His counterattack at Kharkov in February and March of that year recaptured the city and shattered several overextended Soviet formations, transforming what appeared to be a total German collapse into a temporary but stunning reversal. Soviet commanders learned to treat any sector where Manstein held command with extreme caution. He thought several moves ahead, like a grandmaster at chess, and he possessed a rare willingness to trade space for time in ways that other German generals, rigidly bound by Hitler's no-retreat orders, could never manage. Hitler dismissed Manstein in March 1944, exhausted by his constant demands for operational flexibility. The Eastern Front was poorer for his absence. If Manstein was the supreme strategist, then Walter Model was the ultimate firefighter. Known throughout the German military as the Führer's fireman, Model was the general who got thrown into whatever sector was collapsing most catastrophically. He was abrasive, demanding, and utterly relentless, a man who slept little, ate less, and drove his staff to the point of exhaustion. When the massive Soviet summer offensive of 1944, Operation Bagration, obliterated Army Group Center and tore a 300-mile hole in the German line, it was Model who was hurled into the resulting chaos to salvage whatever could be salvaged. He did not save Army Group Center. No commander on Earth could have. But he slowed the Soviet advance just enough to prevent a complete and irreversible disintegration of the entire Eastern Front. Later that same year, on the Western Front, Model commanded the forces that crushed the ambitious Allied airborne operation at Arnhem during Operation Market Garden, handing Montgomery and the Allies one of their most painful and humiliating defeats in the Western campaign. Model was feared not because he possessed the elegant operational vision of Manstein, but because he was stubborn, resourceful, and absolutely refused to accept defeat until every option had been exhausted. He demanded everything from his soldiers and gave everything of himself in return. When his Army Group B was encircled in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945, Model dissolved his command rather than surrender en masse, and then walked into a forest and took his own life. He was 44 years old. What no one on the Allied side fully anticipated in the summer of 1944 was just how fiercely the Germans would fight in Normandy, and much of that savage resistance was shaped by Paul Hausser. Hausser was unique among this list because he was not a Wehrmacht general. He was Waffen-SS. He had spent years building the SS combat divisions from the ground up, transforming them from political ideological formations into some of the most effective and feared fighting units in the entire German military. At the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, his 2nd SS Panzer Corps was positioned at the very center of the German offensive on the southern shoulder, and his divisions fought with a fury that shocked even experienced Soviet defenders. In Normandy the following summer, Hausser commanded the German 7th Army and organized the desperate hedgerow-by-hedgerow defense that bogged down the Allied breakout for weeks, inflicting heavy casualties on American and British forces struggling through the bocage. Hausser himself lost an eye in combat and continued commanding from the field without hesitation. He was feared because of the formations he had forged, divisions whose ideological fanaticism drove them to fight with an intensity that regular Wehrmacht units often could not match. But the darker side of that fanaticism cannot be ignored. Waffen-SS divisions under his broader command committed some of the most horrific atrocities of the war against both prisoners of war and civilians. And that grim reputation only deepened the terror they inspired wherever they appeared on the front line. But the Eastern Front remained the true crucible of fear, and no honest accounting of feared German generals can leave out Ferdinand Schörner. If Model was the firefighter, Schörner was the enforcer. He was Hitler's favorite general during the war's final desperate years, promoted all the way to field marshal in April 1945, one of the very last men to hold that exalted rank. Schörner maintained discipline in his commands, not through respect or tactical brilliance, but through sheer terror. He ordered summary courts-martial and public executions of soldiers he accused of desertion or cowardice, hanging men from trees and lampposts with placards around their necks as warnings to anyone who considered retreating without orders. Troops under his command feared their own commanding general, almost as much as they feared the Red Army advancing from the east. Yet Schörner held Army Group Center together in the final desperate months of fighting on the Eastern Front through this very brutality. And Soviet commanders took his sectors seriously because his battered, demoralized units still fought with a cornered ferocity. But Schörner's legacy is the darkest on this list. When the war ended in May 1945, he stripped off his uniform, abandoned his own troops entirely, and attempted to flee west in civilian clothes to surrender to the Americans, leaving hundreds of thousands of his soldiers to march into Soviet captivity and the horrors that awaited them. He was feared, yes, but he was also despised by many of the men who had bled and died under his command. Now let us shift to a different theater entirely, where another kind of fear took shape among the jagged mountains and narrow river valleys of Italy. Albert Kesselring commanded German forces in the Mediterranean and turned the Italian peninsula into a prolonged nightmare for the advancing Allies. When Italy surrendered in September 1943, many Allied planners expected a relatively swift advance northward toward the Alps. Kesselring shattered that expectation entirely. He moved rapidly to disarm Italian military forces and established a series of heavily fortified defensive lines that transformed every ridge, river crossing, and mountain pass into an interlocking killing ground. The Gustav Line, anchored by the ancient monastery atop Monte Cassino, held the Allies pinned in place for months of brutal, grinding combat through the winter of 1943 and into the spring of 1944. The Anzio landing in January 1944, intended to outflank these defenses and break the stalemate, nearly became a catastrophe when Kesselring's rapid counterattacks threatened to push the entire Allied beachhead back into the Tyrrhenian Sea. Kesselring understood defensive warfare with an intuition that bordered on artistry. He exploited Italy's broken, mountainous terrain to systematically negate every Allied advantage in firepower, air superiority, and industrial output. Every single mile the Allies gained cost them dearly in blood, time, and morale, and Kesselring made absolutely certain of that price. He was nicknamed Smiling Albert for his genial, ever-optimistic demeanor, but there was nothing remotely genial about facing his layered, interlocking defenses. Allied soldiers who fought their way up the Italian boot knew with grim certainty that they were facing a commander who would extract the maximum cost for every hill, every bridge, and every ruined village. And then there was Hermann Balck, a name that even dedicated military history enthusiasts have rarely encountered, yet one that belongs on any serious list of the war's finest tactical commanders. Balck was perhaps the greatest division-level commander of the entire Second World War. In December 1942, as the Soviets launched Operation Uranus and slammed shut the ring around the doomed 6th Army at Stalingrad, Balck's 11th Panzer Division was thrown into the desperate fighting along the Chir River south of the encirclement. The situation was dire. Soviet forces were pouring through widening gaps in the German line, and if they broke through decisively, the entire southern wing of the German army faced catastrophic collapse. Over the course of several harrowing weeks, Balck conducted a series of counterattacks so rapid, so precisely timed, and so devastatingly effective that he destroyed multiple Soviet bridgeheads and prevented the front from disintegrating entirely. His division moved by night across frozen roads, attacked at first light before the Soviets could consolidate their positions, and was already repositioning for the next strike before the enemy could organize a coherent response. Balck understood tempo the way a musician understands rhythm. He knew instinctively that a smaller force, moving faster and striking with greater concentration at the decisive point, could defeat a numerically superior enemy that was slow to react and coordinate. His men suffered enormous casualties in the process, but they held the line. Balck was feared because he was unpredictable, relentlessly aggressive, and seemingly incapable of exhaustion. Let us turn now to a commander whose influence was felt not on the battlefield itself, but in the invisible war of intelligence and deception that shaped every major engagement on the Eastern Front. Reinhard Gehlen ran Foreign Armies East, the Wehrmacht's intelligence division, responsible for analyzing and assessing the entire Soviet military apparatus. Gehlen never commanded a combat division. He never led soldiers under fire or directed an armored assault. But his assessments and strategic estimates informed every major German operational decision, from the gates of Moscow to the rubble of Stalingrad to the killing fields of Kursk. When his intelligence was accurate, German commanders could anticipate Soviet offensives, identify the main axis of attack, and position their precious reserves accordingly. When it was wrong, or more frequently when Hitler chose to dismiss or ignore it, the consequences were devastating. Gehlen grasped the staggering scale of Soviet industrial output and manpower reserves earlier and more clearly than most of his contemporaries in the German High Command, and his repeated warnings about the growing and seemingly inexhaustible strength of the Red Army went unheeded at critical junctures throughout the war. After Germany's surrender, Gehlen became one of the most controversial and consequential figures of the early Cold War. He offered his entire intelligence network, complete with agents and informants still operating behind Soviet lines, to the Americans, and eventually rose to become the founding director of West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst. He was feared not for what he could accomplish with a panzer division or an infantry regiment, but for what he knew and what he could divine about the enemy's intentions before the enemy acted on them. And finally, we come to a general whose name carries a weight unlike any other on this list, not for battles won or armies destroyed, but for a single decision that altered the fate of an entire city. Dietrich von Choltitz was the military governor of Paris in August 1944, and as the Allied armies raced toward the French capital in the weeks following the Normandy breakout, Hitler transmitted a direct and unambiguous order: destroy Paris, burn the city to the ground, demolish every bridge spanning the Seine, mine the Cathedral of Notre Dame, dynamite the Eiffel Tower, reduce the Louvre to rubble, and leave nothing but ash and wreckage for the advancing Allies to liberate. Von Choltitz had the explosives already in position. His engineers had wired the bridges and planted demolition charges at key landmarks across the city. He possessed both the authority and the explicit orders of his supreme commander, and for a brief, terrifying window of several days in late August, the entire fate of one of the world's most beautiful and historically significant cities rested in the hands of a single German officer sitting in the Hotel Meurice. But von Choltitz did not obey. Whether driven by a crisis of conscience, cold military pragmatism, quiet negotiations with the French resistance, or the simple recognition that the war was irretrievably lost and wanton destruction would serve no strategic purpose, he chose to surrender Paris intact to the approaching Free French forces under General Leclerc on August 25, 1944. The fear he inspired was not the fear of a brilliant tactician or a relentless warrior. It was the fear of a man holding a lit match over a city drenched in gasoline. A man who possessed the terrifying power to erase 8 centuries of civilization with a single command. For those few harrowing days, von Choltitz may have been the most dangerous man in all of Europe, not because of what he ultimately did, but because of what he held the power to do. So who was the most feared German general of the Second World War? The answer depends entirely on who was doing the fearing. For the British fighting across the burning sands of North Africa, it was Rommel. For Soviet commanders grinding through the vast, blood-soaked Eastern Front, it was Manstein or Model. For German soldiers themselves, terrified not of the enemy but of their own high command, it might well have been Schörner. And for the people of Paris, holding their breath in August 1944, it was the quiet officer who held their city's fate in his hands. Fear in war is never simple. It is shaped by circumstance, by geography, by the stakes of the moment, and by the particular genius or brutality of the commander you happen to face. But what all these men shared From the desert fox racing across Libya to the savior of Paris sitting alone in a hotel room, was a capacity to bend the course of history through force of will, military skill, and the weight of decisions no human being should ever have to make. Their legacies remain as complicated, as contested, and as unsettling as the war that forged them. If you found this journey through history gripping, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the stories that shaped our world.